The cruelest things never get shouted. They get murmured low and close, in rooms full of people who are smiling at something else. Camille Boudreaux learned that for the second time on a humid October night in the ballroom of the Thibodeau mansion, with a glass of untouched sparkling water sweating in her hand, and 300 of New Orleans' wealthiest people pretending not to notice her. She had not wanted to come. The Audubon Heritage Auction was the kind of event her firm sent junior people to, the kind where old money paraded around in dresses that cost more than her car, bidding on paintings they would hang in houses they barely lived in. But she was 31. She had spent 6 years building a reputation as the best forensic accountant in the city, and her managing partner had told her, gently but unmistakably, that it would be good for her to be seen. So she had bought a deep plum gown that skimmed her hips instead of squeezing them, pinned her dark hair up off her neck, and walked into that ballroom with her chin level and her heart already bracing. She was a big woman. She had always been a big woman, even before the thyroid trouble that arrived the same year her mother got sick, even before the 2 years she spent sleeping in a hospital chair and eating whatever was in the vending machine at 3 a.m., so she wouldn't have to leave her mother's side. The weight had come and it had stayed, and Camille had made a kind of peace with it, the way you make peace with weather. She dressed well. She knew her angles. She had a laugh that made people lean toward her at parties. Most nights, the peace held. It held right up until she saw Grant. Grant Whitfield was standing near the Champagne Tower in a slate-gray suit, holding court with 2 men she recognized from a regional bank board, and he had a woman on his arm. The woman was thin in the specific, effortful way of someone who treated thinness as a profession. Blonde. Young, a diamond on her left hand that caught the chandelier light and threw it across half the room. Camille's stomach dropped the way it does on the first hill of a roller coaster, that lurch where your body realizes the safety bar can't actually save you from what comes next. Grant. Of all the people in all the parishes of Louisiana, Grant Whitfield. They'd been together 4 years. He had spent the last 2 of them teaching her, slowly and patiently, the way you teach a thing to a child, exactly how unlovable she was. Not all at once. Grant was too smart for that. It came in increments. A comment about the dessert menu, a long look at the scale she kept in the bathroom, a joke at a dinner party, told to make everyone laugh. That left her sitting there with a smile stapled to her face while something inside her quietly went dark. By the time he left her, for his Pilates instructor, a girl named Sabrina, who was now apparently his fiancée, Camille had been so thoroughly hollowed out that she had actually thanked him. Thanked him, standing in the doorway of the condo they'd shared, for being honest with her about her body. It had taken her 11 months and a very good therapist to understand what had been done to her. And now here he was, 20 feet away, and the safety bar wasn't going to save her. She turned toward the side hall fast, the way you turn from a stove you've just realized is hot. She almost made it. Camille. His voice carried exactly the way she remembered, warm on the surface and frozen underneath. My God, is that you? She stopped because stopping was less humiliating than running, and she turned with the composure she used in courtrooms when opposing counsel tried to rattle her on the stand. Grant, congratulations. She nodded at Sabrina. On the engagement. He smiled. He stepped close, the way he always had. Close enough that the words became private even in a crowded room. Close enough that Sabrina had to pretend to be interested in the Champagne Tower. I almost didn't recognize you, he said, low and pleasant. I mean, I knew it was probably you. There aren't a lot of women your size who'd squeeze into something like that and call it a good idea. His eyes moved down her body and back up, clinical, the way a man inspects a used car he has no intention of buying. Honestly, Cammy, I thought you'd have figured it out by now. The plum, the way it pulls across the middle. You look like a sofa somebody reupholstered. You let that land. You should eat something, or maybe don't. God knows. There is a particular silence that happens inside a person at a moment like that. Not the silence of having nothing to say. The silence of having every defense you've ever built collapse all at once, so completely that you can't even feel the rubble. Camille felt the heat rush up her throat and into her face. She felt her eyes sting. She did not slap him. She did not say the thing she would 3 days later, lie awake and wish she'd said. She simply set her glass down on the nearest tray, turned, and walked out of the ballroom with her spine very straight and her vision swimming, past a sculptor's bronze and a string quartet sawing through something by Vivaldi, until she found a door and went through it. She did not know, as she went, that one other person in that ballroom had heard every word. The door led her into a long gallery wing the auction house had closed off for the night, dim and cool and smelling of old varnish and lemon polish. Paintings lined the walls, lit only by the security sconces and the smear of streetlight coming through the tall windows. There was a velvet bench in the middle of the room, the kind nobody ever sits on. Camille sat on it. And then, finally, alone, she let herself come apart. She cried the way you cry when you've been holding it for years. Quiet at first, then not quiet. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. She wrapped her other arm around her stomach, around the soft part of her that Grant had taught her to hate, and she hated it now, freshly, viciously, the way you can only hate something you were once told to. "That's a remarkable waste," a voice said from the dock. "Crying over a man who couldn't carry your shadow." Camille came off the bench like she'd been stung. Her heart slammed. She spun toward the far corner of the gallery, where a tall wingback chair sat angled toward the windows, and she realized with a cold prickle down her arms that it had not been empty this whole time. A man rose from it. He did it slowly, unfolding to a height that filled the dim room. And even before the light from the window reached his face, she understood that he was dangerous. The way some weather is dangerous. The way you can feel a storm in your back teeth before the sky goes green. He stepped forward. The streetlight caught him in pieces. A black suit cut so precisely it looked less like clothing than architecture, a jaw shadowed with stubble, dark hair pushed back from a face that was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, all edges and intention. There was ink at the side of his throat, just visible above his collar, something that disappeared under the fabric. His eyes were very dark and very still, and they were fixed on her with an attention that made the rest of the room feel suddenly far away. "I'm sorry," Camille said, scrubbing at her cheeks, smearing her makeup, mortified. I thought this part was closed. I'll go." "Sit down." It wasn't loud. That was the thing about it. He didn't raise his voice at all, but there was an authority in it she had never heard from a living person, a certainty so total it made her knees fold and put her back on the bench before her brain had finished deciding to obey. He didn't sit. He came closer instead, unhurried, and stopped a respectful few feet away, studying her with his head slightly tilted. "People do not weep like that over nothing," he said. "Who taught you to fold yourself up that small?" The question went straight through every wall she had. Maybe it was the dark. Maybe it was that her defenses were already in pieces on the ballroom floor. Maybe it was just that nobody in a very long time had asked her a question that assumed she was worth the answer. "My ex," she said, and her voice cracked on it. He told me I looked like a piece of furniture in front of everyone. He told me I should be ashamed of myself for taking up space." The man went very still. It was not the stillness of a person searching for the polite thing to say. It was the stillness of a predator that has just located something in the grass. The dark of his eyes seemed to deepen. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, lower and quieter, and somehow that made it more frightening, not less. "Your ex," he said, "is a small, frightened animal who has spent his whole life trying to make the world feel as cramped as the inside of his own skull." His gaze moved over her then, but it was nothing like the way Grant had looked at her. There was no inventory in it, no appraisal. It was something closer to recognition, the way you might look at a cathedral you'd only ever seen in pictures. "You are not too much," he said. You were built on a scale most men are too weak to deserve. You take up space because the world was simply incomplete without you in it. Whoever told you otherwise was lying to make himself feel large. Camille's breath caught in her chest and stayed there. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Nobody. She had spent 4 years with a man who measured her, and 31 years in a body the world kept apologizing on her behalf. And now a stranger in the dark had said the thing she had not even known she was starving to hear, and said it like it was simply a fact, like gravity, like the time of day. "He didn't think so," she whispered. "He is a man who was handed something rare," the stranger said, "and was too poor in spirit to know its worth. Tell me his name." "Why?" "Because men who speak to women like you the way he spoke to you tonight," he said, "need to be reminded that the world has rules, and what those rules cost." He took a step closer. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to flinch away, and caught a tear at the corner of her jaw with the side of one finger. His hand was warm, and there were calluses on it, which surprised her on a man dressed like that. His name. Grant, she heard herself say. Grant Whitfield. Something flickered behind his eyes. A flash of heat, there and gone, like the orange seam at the bottom of a fire. "Grant Whitfield," he repeated, tasting it. "I'll keep that." Then, softer. "And yours?" "Camille. Camille Boudreaux." "Camille." He said her name the way you'd handle something that might break, and then he said the next thing the way you'd handle something that might break you. "I'm Dante Moretti." The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. She knew it. Everyone in New Orleans knew it. The way everyone knows the name of the thing in the swamp they don't go looking for. The Morettis had run the riverside of this city for 3 generations. The docks, the shipping, the long gray channels where legitimate money and the other kind got so tangled together that nobody bothered separating them anymore. Dante Moretti was the man other powerful men lowered their voices to discuss. He was the reason certain city councilmen retired suddenly to Florida. He was a ghost story with a tailor. And she had just stood in a dark room and cried to him about her ex-boyfriend. Camille got to her feet, and now it was fear doing the moving fast and cold. "I have to go," she said. "I'm Mr. Moretti. I'm sorry I didn't realize who I was. I should never have." "You're not going anywhere." He didn't grab her. He didn't have to. He simply said it, and the words settled over the door like a locked gate. "Not back out there, alone, with your face like that, so that man can watch you flee and feel like a king. No." He looked at her, and for the first time something almost gentle moved through the danger in his face. "You're going to walk back into that room. You're going to hold your head up. And you're going to do it on my arm." "I can't," she said, and the tears threatened again. He'll do nothing," Dante said, "because the only thing a man like Grant Whitfield understands is the food chain. And tonight, Beleza, he's going to learn where he stands on it." She should have run. Every reasonable part of her was screaming to run. But there was something in his eyes that was not pity. She had drowned in pity for 2 years, and she knew its taste, and that absence of pity did something to her that no kindness had managed in 11 months. It made her feel, for one impossible second, like she was not a problem to be managed. Like she was, instead, something worth burning a room down over. She took his arm. The muscle under the fine wool was like rebar. He set his other hand briefly over hers, the way you'd steady a thing you intend to keep, and then he pushed open the door and walked her back into the light. The effect was immediate and total. It was as though a shark had slid into a tide pool. The nearest knot of conversation simply stopped. Then the next. Heads turned, and the turning spread outward across the ballroom like a ripple, and a path opened. Actually opened. People stepping back without seeming to decide to, clearing a lane through the crowd as if the floor itself had tilted. The string quartet faltered on a note and recovered. Somewhere, a woman's laugh died in her throat. and Camille walked through all of it on Dante Moretti's arm, and for the first time in her life nobody was looking at her body. They were looking at him, and at the impossible fact of her beside him. And what she saw in their faces was not the thing she had braced for. It was not contempt, it was awe, and under the awe, a clean bright thread of fear. She felt something unfamiliar straighten up inside her. She felt of all things tall. Dante walked slowly. He was in no hurry. He was making a point of being in no hurry, and the point was her, claiming her, draping her in the unbearable weight of his attention so that the whole room had to look. His dark eyes swept the floor with the patience of a man who already knew where his target stood, and then they stopped. Grant was near the champagne tower, mid-laugh, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He glanced over the way you glance at a disturbance, and his laugh died on his face. The color went out of him so fast it was almost theatrical. Grant managed money for some very serious people. He knew exactly whose face he was looking at, and he knew exactly what the rumors said that face was capable of. Dante steered them straight toward him, easy as a man crossing his own living room. Sabrina, sensing weather, took a small step away from her fiancé. Mr. Whitfield. Dante's voice was almost warm. That was the worst part. I don't believe we've met. Mr. Moretti? Grant's voice came out an octave too high. He shot a glance at Camille and then couldn't seem to look at her, his eyes pinballing between her face and the man beside her as the math assembled itself in his head. It's an honor, sir. I didn't realize you were. I find these events educational, Dante said, adjusting one cuff with great care. For instance, tonight I learned that there's a man at this party who likes to whisper cruel things to a beautiful woman in a crowded room where he thinks no one important is listening. He let his gaze come up slow and fix on Grant's. I was in the gallery. I heard a man tell this remarkable woman that she should be ashamed of the space she occupies. A pause that stretched until it hurt. I have a strong dislike of small men with loud opinions about things they could never have earned. Sir, Grant's mouth worked. That was a private. There was a misunderstanding. Was there? Dante tilted his head. I'm not aware of anyone laughing, Grant. Are you? No, sir, Grant whispered. The bourbon was trembling in his hand. Camille is under my protection tonight. Dante said it at a perfectly conversational volume, and yet it carried to the edges of the silent ballroom like a struck bell. Do you understand what that means? It means that her name is now attached to mine, and men who insult things attached to my name have always found that the world becomes a much smaller, much colder place for them very quickly. He leaned in and dropped his voice to a register meant for Grant alone, though Camille stood close enough to catch every syllable. Apologies are weather, Mr. Whitfield. They blow through and change nothing. I much prefer consequences. He straightened and gave a small, terrible smile. Enjoy your evening. I'd savor it. It may be the last quiet one you have for a while. He turned, unbothered, and offered Camille his arm again. I think we've had our fill of charity, Belisa. Let me take you out of here. She could only nod. Behind her, she heard the sound of Grant setting his glass down on a table because his hand could no longer be trusted to hold it. The night air outside was warm and wet and full of the river. A black SUV waited at the foot of the mansion steps, a man the size of a door holding the rear door open. Dante shrugged out of his jacket and settled it over her bare shoulders without asking. It was heavy, and it smelled of cedar and something darker underneath, and it swallowed her whole. You didn't have to do that, Camille said. The adrenaline was draining out of her now and leaving her shaky in its wake. I disagree. He looked down at her, and the streetlight made hard shadows of his face. He needed to remember he's prey, not a predator. It's good for men like that. Keeps the ecosystem honest. She gave a thin, disbelieving laugh. So you scared him? Dante paused with his hand on the door of the car. He looked at her, and a slow, dark smile moved across his mouth. and it was the smile of a man who has already finished a thing the rest of the world hasn't realized has started. "Oh, Camille," he said softly. That was an introduction, not a conclusion. He helped her into the seat, and as he came around and settled in beside her, he went on as though discussing the weather. "Grant Whitfield manages offshore accounts for the Delacroix family. I've known about him for 2 years. I simply hadn't had a reason to care." His dark eyes found hers in the dim of the car. "Now I have one. By Monday his accounts will be frozen. By Wednesday the federal people will be very curious about certain wire transfers. By the end of the week, he'll have no money, no firm, and the list of extremely unpleasant clients wondering where their money went." The smile again. "And the Delacroix do not file complaints. They collect." Camille stared at him, a heart stopping in her chest. "You're going to destroy his entire life." He reached over and, with surprising gentleness, brushed a strand of hair from her wet cheek. "I'm going to take it apart at the seams," he said, "because nobody makes my woman cry." She should have been horrified. Some part of her was. But a much older part of her, the part that had been folded up small for 2 years and shoved into a closet, sat up in the dark of that car and felt something it had forgotten how to feel. What Dante Moretti did not yet know, what Camille herself would not fully understand until 2 days later, sitting at her own kitchen table with a legal pad and a pot of coffee, was that he was not the only person in that car who knew how to take a man apart. Because Camille Boudreaux was the best forensic accountant in the state of Louisiana, and she had spent the first year of a relationship with Grant Whitfield doing him a favor before she'd known what kind of man he was, quietly helping him clean up what he'd called a few messy spreadsheets for a client he wouldn't name. She had not understood at the time what she was looking at. She understood it perfectly now. Monday came for Grant exactly the way Dante had promised. He arrived at the glass tower on Poydras Street at 6 in the morning, already sweating through a $400 shirt, and his key card flashed red at the executive elevator. By the time he'd slapped the reader 3 times, the federal agents were already crossing the marble lobby toward him with a warrant and a stack of empty file boxes, and his accounts were frozen, and the data, 10 years of encrypted ledgers detailing exactly how he'd funneled the Delacroix family's money through a maze of shell companies in the Caymans, had landed in a federal inbox at 3 that morning from a sender no one could trace. What the agents did not know, and what Dante would not learn until much later, was that the data dump had not come from him. It had come from a backup drive Camille had kept for 4 years in a fireproof box under her bed, the way a careful woman keeps a record of the things that might one day be used against her. She had spent Sunday night organizing it. She had annotated it. She had made it legible and damning and airtight. And then she had sent it into the dark and made herself a cup of tea and slept better than she had in 11 months. She did not tell Dante. Not yet. She wanted to see, first, what kind of man he was when he thought he was doing it all himself. By noon, Grant's face was on every local news channel. By 2, his fiancée Sabrina was hauling matching luggage into the back of a rideshare outside their condo, sliding on enormous sunglasses, telling him through a thin, disgusted mouth that her card had been declined at the coffee shop that morning and that she had no intention of being the girlfriend of a broke felon with the Delacroix syndicate looking for him. Tao pulled away. Grant stood in the driveway alone in the bright, flat New Orleans light and discovered the precise weight of every cruel thing he had ever said. That evening, a box arrived at Camille's apartment in the Marigny. Matte black, tied with a heavy ribbon, no delivery driver in sight. Inside, under layers of dark tissue, was a dress. Not a dress meant to hide her. She could tell that just by touching it. The fabric was a deep, burning copper, heavy and rich, and it had been cut. She could see it. She who knew how clothes were built, to do the opposite of everything she'd been taught to ask of clothing. It was made to follow the line of her hip instead of fighting it, to hold the fullness of her instead of pretending it away. Tucked into the neckline was a card in sharp, certain handwriting. A woman shaped like a cathedral should never dress to apologize. Wear this. My car comes at 8. She stood in her small kitchen holding the card, and she made a decision that surprised her. She was not going to be rescued. She had had enough of being a thing that things happened to. She put on the copper dress, and it was, God help her, the most beautiful she had ever looked. The fabric catching the light and the shape of her like the whole point had always been to be seen. And she got into the car, and she went to him not as a woman being collected, but as a woman who had something to say. He had taken a private room at a restaurant high above the river, all glass and low gold light, and the city sprawled out below like a circuit board. When she stepped out of the elevator, he rose, and for a moment the assured danger went entirely out of his face and left something younger and more astonished underneath. "Madonna," he said quietly. "Words are failing me, Camille." "Then let me talk," she said. She told him over the first course. She told him about the backup drive and the spreadsheets and the favor she'd done a man before she understood the shape of him. She told him it had not been his data dump that put Grant Whitfield in handcuffs. It had been hers. She had simply let him think otherwise, because she had needed to know whether the man across the table was the kind who'd be threatened by it. She watched his face the whole time, ready for the flicker of male ego, the cooling, the recalibration. It didn't come. Instead, slowly, Dante Moretti began to smile. A real one, the danger giving way to something that was almost delight. "You let me believe I did it," he said. "I let you show me who you were first." He sat back. He looked at her the way a man looked at the answer to a question he'd stopped expecting anyone to answer. "Every man at that gala," he said, "looked at you and saw what your fool of an ex trained them to see. And the whole time, you were the most dangerous person in the room." He shook his head slowly. "You weren't waiting to be saved, Beliza. You were deciding whether I was worth the time it'd take to explain that to me." "More or less," Camille said, and took a sip of wine, and felt, for the first time in years, completely and unapologetically large in the world. Exactly the right amount of large. The amount the room had been missing. They were on the dessert when the doors at the far end of the room burst open. 2 of Dante's men dragged a thrashing figure across the carpet and dropped him onto it. Grant. His suit was torn. One eye was swelling shut, and he had the wild, blown-out look of a man being hunted. He'd been caught, one of the guards reported, trying to bribe a valet into telling him where Moretti was. Grant got to his knees. His eyes found Dante, and then they found Camille, and his jaw came loose. He was looking at her in the copper dress, standing tall beside the most powerful man in Louisiana, and she watched the recognition crawl across his ruined face that this was not the woman he had spent 2 years teaching to shrink. This was someone he didn't have the language for. "Camille," his voice came out cracked and high. "Camille, please. You have to tell him to stop, the Delacroix. They're outside my building. They're going to kill me. Tell him to give the money back. Tell him." He was crying now, crawling forward an inch before a guard's shoe came down on his shoulder and pinned him. "You're a good person. You were always too good for me. I know that. I always knew that. That's why I was scared, Cammy. I was insecure. I made you small so you wouldn't see how small I was. Please, you have to save me." For 4 years she had believed that her job, her purpose, the whole shape of her usefulness, was to make this man comfortable, to absorb his cruelty and convert it into patience, to be always the bigger person in every way he meant it as an insult. She looked down at him now, at the wet wreck of him on the carpet, and she searched herself for the old reflex. The guilt. The pull to fix it. It wasn't there. There was just a vast, clean quiet where it used to be. "You called me a piece of furniture, Grant," she said, and her voice was steady as a level. "In front of 300 people, you told me I should be ashamed to take up room." She tilted her head the way Dante had, and some of him had gotten into her. Or maybe it had always been in her and just needed the air. I spent 2 years apologizing for existing because you needed me down there so you could feel tall. I'm not going to spend 2 seconds saving you so you can do it to the next one. Camille. And by the way, she said, the data the feds got, the 10 years of ledgers, she let it sit. You should have remembered who you asked to clean up your spreadsheets. I'm very good at my job. The understanding that moved across his face was, she would admit later, the single most satisfying thing she had ever watched happen. Dante had risen from the table. He came around it without hurry and stood over Grant, and when he spoke it was almost gentle, which was how she'd learned to know he meant it most. You don't speak to her again, Dante said. You don't look at her. And you certainly don't crawl to her for mercy, because mercy is hers to give and you've never once in your life earned the right to ask her for anything. He crouched, so they were eye to eye. You were handed something most men spend their whole lives hoping to deserve. And you spat on it, because you were too small to hold its weight. He stood, and the gentleness went out of him like a light switched off. Now you belong to the people you stole from. He nodded once at his men. Take him to the loading dock. The Delacroix are waiting. They hauled Grant up by the arms. He was still screaming her name as they dragged him backward through the doors. Camille, Camille, please, and the sound of it stretched thin down the long hallway, and then the doors closed, and there was only the quiet of the river, and the gold light, and the two of them. Camille stood very still. The reality of what she'd just witnessed sat heavy in the room. Dante's world was real, and it was dark, and it was absolute, and there was no pretending otherwise. He turned to her. The lethal cold drained out of his face and left only that astonished warmth, and he closed the distance between them and brought his hands up to cradle her jaw, his thumbs moving slow along her cheekbones. Are you afraid of me? He asked low. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the whole long architecture of her life, the years of making herself smaller, the man being dragged screaming down a hallway, the strange and terrible mercy of being seen at last by someone who refused to look away. No, she said. And then, because it was true, I'm not afraid of you. I'm just not used to being on this side of the table. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, raw with relief, and rested his forehead against hers. Then get used to it, he said, because from tonight, no one shrinks you again. Not him. Not anyone. You were never too much, Beliza. The world was just too small. We'll make it bigger. Outside, far below, a black sedan pulled away from a loading dock and turned toward the river, and Grant Whitfield went to meet the consequences that apologies had never once managed to outrun, while high above the city, in a room full of gold light, a woman who had spent her whole life being told to take up less space finally, fully, took up all the room she was owed and found that it suited her and that the man beside her would have burned the entire city to the waterline just to keep it lit for her. What stays with me about Camille isn't the copper dress or the man with ink on his throat. It's the 11 months she spent learning the difference between a voice that wants you smaller and one that wants you whole. Grant didn't break her in one night at that gala. He broke her in increments. The way water breaks stone. A comment here, a long look there, until she was thanking him in a doorway for teaching her to hate her own reflection. That's how it always works. The damage that lasts is the quiet kind, and the people who do it count on you being too kind to call it what it is. But here's the thing I keep turning over. Camille didn't win because a dangerous man walked out of the shadows. She won because of who she already was before he ever did. She kept that backup drive in a fireproof box under her bed for 4 years, not out of revenge, but because she was the kind of person who pays attention, who does the work even when no one's watching, who never let Grant's cruelty turn her stupid or careless. Her sharpness was the weapon. Dante just opened the door. She walked through it on her own. And she had a spine I didn't see coming. 2 years of being told to take up less space, and when the moment came, she didn't beg, didn't soften, didn't rush to rescue the man crawling at her feet because some old reflex told her that was her job. She looked at Grant and felt nothing but quiet. That kind of steadiness isn't a gift. You build it, one refusal at a time, until you can stand in a room with a person who hurt you and stay perfectly level. What I want anybody listening to take from this is simpler than the drama makes it sound. Be the kind of person who keeps their hands clean even when keeping them dirty would be easier. Because in the end, Grant's own choices, not Camille's, were what put him on that floor. Stay sharp, keep learning, keep noticing, keep records of your own life, because nobody can take advantage of a woman who understands the math. And when somebody spends years teaching you to shrink, find the stubbornness to stay exactly your own size. The cruelty other people hand you is theirs to answer for. What you do with it is yours. Grant got the consequences he built with his own mouth, one whispered insult at a time. Camille got the life she'd been quietly earning the whole way through. That isn't luck, and it isn't a Mafia king. It's character meeting brains meeting the refusal to fold. Carry those three things, and you won't need anyone to burn a city down for you. You'll already be the most dangerous person in the room.